my name is Alex Solunac. I'm I live in Victoria, British Columbia, and I guess I've been involved in Sasquatch research for about the last 25 years or so, since the early 1990s. I guess that's longer than 25 years now. Um, and yeah, before that, I mean, of course, I had an interest in it as a kid in the early 70s, and I was very lucky to be able to meet and know people like John Green, Grover Krantz, um, Rene DeHinden, John Bindernagel. So it's been very fulfilling in that sense that I was able to have working relationships with a lot of these gentlemen in the last few years doing Sasquatch research.
So have you ever seen a Sasquatch yourself?
No,
Have you seen evidence?
well, when you say evidence, there's a lot of things out there. A big part of my talk that I just did was on looking at possible evidence and debunking it, because there is a lot out there that there's a lot of things in nature that can create what people refer to as Sasquatch evidence. So, to me, I would say tracks, finding possible hair samples, eDNA testing. My whole background in with it is very scientific based. So when I hear about people having feelings or seeing something that they can't prove that the Sasquatch did, I don't really consider that to be evidence in any way. Um, Here on the island, again, it's our research area. We've got a couple of active research areas where we have trail cameras and areas where we go out to investigate. What we do find is that, you know, we're very much along the lines of physical evidence, and that it is basically, again, following along the same lines of that as tracks. And again, there's so many different things with Sasquatch research that it needs more proof. So technically, I would say that when it comes to evidence, we have discovered some tracks here on the island, and I've talked to a lot of eyewitnesses of people, and that's sort of the first step in the voyage of discovery with any kind of animal species. And of course, most of the people that I've interviewed and that have had sightings have all basically described the same thing. They've seen something and it quickly moves out of the area. It doesn't stick around. So generally those are the majority of sightings that we get here on the island, is that they just witness for a very short period of time, usually on a logging road or something like this, and a Sasquatch crossing the road, or they spot it in the woods and it disappears quite quickly, heads off. And for some reason, people are very hesitant to follow them. So that's often where the sighting ends.
Hi, I'm Linda Eastburn of Linda Eastburn YouTube channel, and I have a new book out called Threshold to Encounters. It's about 40 years of research and experience with all of these wild cryptids that many of you I know have encountered yourself. You can find it on Amazon.com. So have you met anyone that's had a longer span of time where they've had a somewhat of a confrontation, I would say, spot on face to face with the Sasquatch?
No, I know there's a lot of that kind of stuff out there as far as people having over years multiple sightings and this kind of stuff. We've run into these kind of people, but when it gets to the next steps of putting trail cameras on their property and this kind of stuff, it either appears that the sightings kind of end after that, or that they're hesitant to do this. So at that point, it stalls the research. I mean, you can, without data, you just have an opinion. And that is the thing with Sasquatch research, is that there's a lot of people out there that aren't really working hard on providing their data and doing that kind of process. It's not as exciting, of course. It's a lot of it's paperwork, a lot of it's reviewing footage, listening to audio when you've got 24-hour audio out in an area. But that's what you need to do for this to move forward in the scientific realm of research.
So do you consider the vocals, the audio portions of this, any of that to be valid evidence?
Well, it's very interesting. I can say that myself and the researchers that I work with here on the South Island, we have over the last few years had about 6 or 7 incidents where we've heard these roaring howls that we've heard out in the woods. And it's not just in one area, it's in multiple areas on the island. Now, can I say a Sasquatch made those sounds? I really can't. I didn't see the animal making the sounds at all. Um, but listening to other known animals that are resident here on the island, nothing at all matches to that. Could they have been made by a person? Some of the areas that we're in are very, very remote, and the chance of somebody screaming at that kind of volume and having that kind of range in their voice and carrying that kind of a distance would be difficult to sort of believe. Um, but can I say that they were Sasquatches that made those sounds? I really can't. I didn't see the animal make the sound. So it's just a speculation that that is a possibility.
Yeah, a lot of the vocals, there isn't a body that's
Yeah,
accompanying that. Yeah, I understand that. What do you
yeah.
think about the Sierra sounds?
I've met Ron Moorhead a few times, super nice guy, and I think definitely something happened there. I always think to myself, well, maybe we'll get some more of those kind of sounds, that kind of vocalization or chatter in that. And so far we haven't. Now that was kind of a unique situation, in the sense that it those hunters were going to that same area for quite a number of years, and maybe it was just a very unique situation because we really haven't had anything quite like that since. Um, and again, I did meet Al Berry a few years ago, and of course he wasn't one of the hunters. He worked more in the media, and he went out with them. And talking with him, he was very convinced that there was something going on. He did not believe he was being fooled or anything or tricked by these fellas. He basically, you know, in his unbiased mind, he really did believe that there was something out there making those sounds. So,
Have you heard Scott Nelson's interpretation of the linguistics of that, the language portion of it? Have you heard of that?
yeah, I met him. I think it was at the Yakima Bigfoot Roundup for Bob Gimlin. Um, it's interesting, and I mean, obviously, all kinds of animals have interactions with each other, right? Um, and is a lot of it vocal? Well, possibly it is. They always say that with, say, for instance, cats, other than being around people, they don't really vocalize a lot. A lot of it's more visual communications and this kind of thing. Um, but to have a language and all this, you need to have with any kind of a language. We've seen this a lot in North America, with a lot of First Nations languages. Unless you have active people in an area speaking it and passing it on to the next generation, it's difficult to keep a language alive without a large number of people speaking it in an area where they can communicate on a regular basis. Now, from what we can theorize from Sasquatch is that they do tend to be very much of a loner, it seems. There's very few cases of them with family groups. I mean, there's definitely been sightings here on the island where there were two of them, a much larger one and a younger one. So obviously, like with any kind of species, in the rearing process, and if they're like people in the sense that once we have children, we just can't let them wander off. They stay with us for quite a few years and they learn a lot of different things. Um, but does that process include a language that can be communicated, and do they communicate with other rogue ones that they come across? I mean, it's purely just speculation, right? I think at this point we just don't know enough about it.
I have interviewed several people that have heard something that they refer to as a kind of chatter, somewhat similar to the Sierra Sounds, but maybe not exactly like the Sierra Sounds. And I agree with you. The Sierra Sounds was a
Mhm.
unique time and a unique place. It was so remote and
Yes.
so isolated, from anything else. And of course, there were a lot of very strange things happening up there, not just those sounds. I don't believe they even will say 100% for sure that that was a Bigfoot making that sound, because they didn't see who made the sounds either. They
Yes.
just
Yeah.
reported them. But there were some strange things that happened, and this is a repetitive thing I hear from researchers. They'll be out camping, they're in their tent, they hear this massive noise going on outside. It happened at the Sierra Sounds. Ron Moore had talked about it. It sounded like the camp was just being absolutely torn apart, just, things being thrown everywhere. And they anticipated getting up the next day, going outside and finding a mess. And they get up and they see absolutely nothing has been moved. What do you think? What do you make of that? That's an unusual, repetitive thing I hear.
Well, I don't really know. I don't know enough details about it to comment on it. Um, yeah, I will say this is that when you're out in the wilderness and it's very quiet, a lot quieter than being in the city or in the suburbs, your senses do tend to really awaken and you start to hear a lot more than you generally would. We tend to hear so many different noises when we're in a commercial or a residential environment that we tend to sort of put up a wall and we get a lot of it out because it would just drive us probably bonkers. And so for a lot of people, when they get out in the wilderness, all those senses are very heightened. And often they will hear like a bird on the lake or something that's quite a distance away. Um, but I can't explain exactly why people would hear like a large amount of commotion and then find no results from that, unless it was further away than the area that they checked out in the morning. I mean, that's just a possibility, but I really can't comment on exactly. It's never happened to me in that situation or anything.
No, I haven't had anything like that happen either. So I don't know, but I hear that from various people. So, I don't know exactly what they're experiencing. With Scott Nelson and Ron Moorhead, of course, they repetitively went back to that location and periodically they would have some experiences, but nothing like that, the recordings that happened in, the 70s. Some people think they're fake. Do you think they're real or do you think they're fake?
I really don't know. I mean, again, having met Ron and Alan, they both seem very, very credible people to me. So, but whether or not somebody else was up there fooling them, I don't know. But to me, um, I'd like to find out more information, and again, I think the icing on the cake would be if the other people started hearing that same sort of vocalizations. But again, maybe that was just a unique situation at that particular time.
Exactly.
Um,
And it was
you
so
know,
loud. I mean, that was the thing that the recording and it was just so much louder than most of the
yes.
people that talk about hearing vocals. They're not quite that pronounced, not that close, and certainly not with that much dialect, the variations in the sounds. I mean, you could
Hmm.
actually, hear the difference, what appeared to be or what sounded like more of a deeper voice, a male, a female, and perhaps even a child, because the voice sounds like it would fit the body of a male, female, and a child. So I found that to be quite interesting in the Sierra Sounds. And then also the inflections of the sounds as well was very almost human-like in that, there was emotion with them. There was a lot of change and another thing Scott Nelson found was the repetition of the way they ended certain sentences. And there are certain indigenous people and other languages around the world that they would have this kind of like they end a sentence and it's kind of like, okay, now you take over. It was kind of like that inflection in the sounds. So all of those observations I found to be really an interesting and in-depth look at those. Probably some of the more interesting things. Of course, I started my journey out by doing an interview with Scott Nelson. So that was my first introduction into anything into this subject matter. So it was quite an initiation. What do you think about the Patterson Gimlin film?
I My thought is that it truly is a piece of footage of an actual Sasquatch. Um, Again, when you look at it, it's held up over all these years. I mean, obviously, there's tons of people that say it was fake and everything. I don't think they really realize that, Roger and Bob were basically the horsemen, right? They were rodeo people and stuff like this. And when you consider that at the time, the closest thing that Hollywood, with all the money they've got behind it in 1968, a year later, had was Planet of the Apes. I mean, no one's fooled that when you see Roddy McDowell walking around on that in that movie, that it wasn't just a person in a costume, right? So, I mean, it's held up over all these years, and this is way before AI and all the kind of technologies that we have at our disposal now to do stuff. Um, to me, it is probably the and again, this is the hard part when it comes to so many different things. It's visual evidence, and it does have its weight, but it doesn't prove anything. So I think though it definitely the one thing it really did do was it basically made a phenomena that was at that time just basically primarily in the Pacific Northwest become more exposed to a lot more people. And it turned on a lot of different investigators, and I can include myself in that. When I was 5 years old, um, John Green and Rennie DeHinden were showing the film in movie theaters, like in theaters, and in small towns and all this. About the Sasquatch. And so there was an ad on television back when we had like three channels for this upcoming event, and they showed the little clip of the Patterson footage. And I was about maybe 5 or 6 years old, and that was when I first saw it. And I think I probably drove my mom bonkers for the next few weeks because that's all I could talk about. I couldn't believe that, when I asked her about this, I said, "Well, what was that?" She says, "Well, it's this monster that lives in the woods, right?" And I knew what monsters were even at that young age, Frankenstein and all this kind of stuff. Those were all made up things, but this was a real thing. And I couldn't understand why more people weren't concerned about this, that there was this unknown monster in the woods. So very quickly over the next few years, she got me all of John Green's books. And I used to get the Bigfoot News, the Peter Burns monthly newsletter. This would be all around 1975, 76. And then, got to meet John Green and stuff like that. So it really started me on my journey, the Patterson footage. So I did have a chance a few years ago to thank Bob Gillen for that. I said, this is it was because of seeing that footage, it really set me on my interest in this particular subject. So yes, I do think they did really capture a Sasquatch, and it was so unique in that situation too that in the whole Bluff Creek area, there had been a major flooding in 1964, so like 2 or 3 years before this footage happened, and it cleared out all the trees along the creek at that point. If that hadn't happened, if they had still gone down that area and down to the creek, all those open banks and the distance you can see in that area was all heavily forested before the flooding that happened. So it was because of that flooding, it allowed them to actually visually see the creature and also to get on footage, basically for the most part unobstructed, of it walking away from them on the other side of the creek. So we can be thankful for that terrible flooding that happened a few years earlier for them to get that amazing footage.
Yeah, it is quite amazing and very interesting. A lot of people have studied the physical body, and costume just wouldn't cut it. It's
Yeah.
it's the way the body moves, the way the muscle has to move, and the proportions of the muscles within that the hair. It is kind of a rather convincing film, I have to agree. So you met
Yeah.
John Green. Tell me what your impression was. What did you talk about with John Green?
Well, I met John Green quite a few times, and actually back in 2011, my late wife and Tom Yamarone and I, we put on uh, a conference sort of celebrating John Green and his writings. And we put that on at Harrison Hot Springs where John lived. And it was great. We had over 300 people come out for the conference. So we had Chris Murphy, Jeff Meldrin, we had Igor Bortsov, we had Lauren Coleman. So it was a great amount of different investigators all came out, and other authors to celebrate John Green. So yeah, I mean, John Green was a newspaper guy. And when he took over the newspaper in Agassiz, which is a small town close to where Harrison Hot Springs is, back in 1956, that was the Diamond Jubilee for the province of British Columbia. So 75 years So they had offered different communities throughout the province a bit of money so that they could put on something to celebrate that, sort of the special date coming up in the summer. So they were debating what they could do to bring people to Agassiz and everything. And somebody said, well, there's always these Sasquatch sightings. We should have a Sasquatch hunt, and make it it's sort of a jovial kind of thing, right? Come out and hunt for the Sasquatch. And that's sort of the first time John took it kind of serious, because after the meeting, there were a few people that said to him, oh, my friends have seen it and everything. And John, it went from being something that he thought was something farcical and everything, as a legend or something, to actually talking to people that had actually seen a Sasquatch. And these were people he knew from that business people that he worked with, people in his community. So at that point, he thought, well, there's really something to this. And that's when he started really doing his research on it. And he found out about the fact that in the 1940s, a few years earlier, that there had been the sighting at Ruby Creek, which is quite a famous sighting, multiple witness sighting, and the fact that there was a sheriff from Whatcom County, just south of the border, had come up and casted some of the tracks. And when John inquired about the tracks, they'd gotten broken or they'd gotten lost. So they didn't have them anymore. But he was able to talk to a lot of people that actually were at that sighting, had seen the tracks, counted the tracks, and had talked in depth to the woman and the children that had seen the Sasquatch. So those were all the things that sort of convinced John that there was something more to this. And then, of course, the other sort of part of it is that at that same time, Rene de Hinden moved to Harrison Hot Springs from Alberta. He'd originally come from Switzerland, but was working on a farm in Alberta. And he had read something in the paper about the Sasquatch. And he mentioned to the farmer that he was working for, he said, oh, I'd like to find out more about this thing. I need to go, or it was actually the Himalayas. It was a report about the uh, the abominable snowman that was making the rounds, of course, in the mid 50s. And the farmer said to me, he says, well, you don't need to go all the way to Nepal to see an animal like this. They have them in British Columbia. So that was the first time Renee had ever heard about this. But then when he walked in and started talking to John, and John, they worked together for quite a few years earlier on, from the 50s and in the 60s, and it kind of ended probably around, I guess, when the Bosberg 69. But they were very close and worked very closely together with their research. And yeah, so again, with John, he always said first and foremost, he was a newspaper reporter. He reported facts. Um, he, a strange howl or a feeling and this kind of stuff or things like that, he would take the report down, but they never made it into his books because he said there just does not enough information there to support anything. So he was very much just looking for sightings and for tracks. Um, so that's when you read a lot of his books, they're very well written that way, because as a reporter, he was just using those skills of just, with the facts and keeping it very much that way. And I think that's why his reports and everything are very enjoyable to read. And also too, they tend to be full of information. His interviewing skills are very good as well. I think in his first book, On Track of the Sasquatch, you can sort of see some of his Q&As he had with recorded interviews, very much aware that when you're interviewing somebody, you don't lead them with any kind of questions and all this. You just let them report the facts as it happened to them.
So you had quite a few people at this conference back in 2011 that you sponsored. What did you take out of that conference? What did you learn from these people?
Well, again, the majority of it was basically a tribute to John Green. So um, it wasn't the sort of average conference where you're talking about your different research and this kind of stuff. There was a little bit of that, but it was just basically paying their respects to John for all the work he did as one of the first people to write about the Sasquatch and his research, and also too the other nice thing about John was he always had time for other researchers and that. I mean, um, he was always willing to share his research, and so I mean, it was a lot of people I knew, would always sort of make the journey to Harrison Hot Springs to meet with him, as a bit of a homage, I guess you could say. But he's a very, very nice fella, and as I say, he did a lot for Sasquatch research when basically in the late 50s, 1960s, when it didn't really extend much further out than the Pacific Northwest of being a known thing. I can remember, I mean, everyone knows about the Sasquatch now, just thankfully, I guess, to mass media. But of course, once mass media gets on something, it can twist and turn things and make it into like a caricature, as we've seen. So it takes away from the facts of things, and people sort of tend to think of the Sasquatch as being sort of a something that was dreamed up by the media in the late 50s, back when Jerry Crew found those tracks, and it got the name Bigfoot, you know. But I mean, people at that point don't realize that there were like literally hundreds of different sightings uh, in American and Canadian newspapers that, date back into the mid 1800s. And before that, we have First Nations reports and legends, and it's in their art of the Sasquatch. So, I mean, this isn't just something that came along a few years ago, but looking at it from the surface, people that are maybe new to this interest, the Sasquatch would just assume that this is just something that's a relatively new thing that was dreamed up by pop culture.
Well, it certainly has become more popular, let's put it like that. I do remember doing an interview with a gentleman that his father was in a community college, and this was back in the 1940s. And there was a book, or the book was published in the 1940s in Southern California, and it was about local history. And it was a history class, but it was local history class. And in that book, it actually talked about a Sasquatch being captured, killed, and taken to some, I don't remember if it was a hospital or some kind of a laboratory for it to be studied or something like this. But this was in a history book. So this was not something that was completely, off base. I don't think it would have made it all the way to a history book used by a community college if it had not had some validity.
There have been different stories like that. There was another one, I think, in Georgia that I read about, and this was in John Green's book, where in the 1940s, there was reports of this animal coming through and destroying chicken coops, and so a bunch of guys got together and stalked it and shot it, and people remember seeing this in the back of a pickup truck. And again, this is the 1940s. The trucks didn't have very long boxes, but its head was up against the cab and its feet were sort of almost touching the ground with the tailgate down. Um, it's hard. I mean, people, you hear about these things, but without any sort of evidence, it's very difficult to look back at these stories and be able to take any more information out of it if that's the only level that it is, where it's a story that's told to somebody else. And this comes full circle back to the research part of things. You know, um, when we head out to set up our trail cameras and everything, we're very diligent at getting, the GPS coordinates for where the cameras are set up. We take multiple pictures from different angles of where the camera is. Before we take the cameras down to check the footage, we also take extra photos there. And often we're standing in the photos because we know how tall we are, this kind of thing. So that if any of the photos, something appears in there that could possibly be a Sasquatch or something, we would have a good ability to go back to that area and take proper measurements of things. Um, the one thing that's always bothered me is when someone will send me a photo of a footprint and they'll just put their foot next to it. And I realize that's probably all they've got. They're out for a hike or whatever, and they've come across this, but I don't know how long their foot is. So I always recommend to people just take along some measuring tapes with you always, because that will always provide more information as to the size of something if you're measuring it out in the field. So yeah, it all comes down to that. I mean, we've got a lot of these different reports that are very difficult for us to get any more information out of, other than that it seems like just kind of an amazing story. So
Have you heard of the Olympic Project and
yep.
the Big Nest? Have you seen those by chance?
Yeah, I've just seen them on television. I haven't gone down. I've been down to that area before, because as the crow flies, it's only about 25 miles, 30 miles from where we are in Victoria. It's 20 miles across the Straits of Juan de Fuca, and then just sort of west of Port Angeles. Um, I guess I was down there probably in 2008, I guess maybe. Um, it's interesting. I think what they really need to do with that particular situation is they need to, get some hair samples out of them because there's other animals that do make nests. Bears will make what they call day beds, and I've come across a lot of them in the woods here on the island. Um, of course, some of the nests that get reported that could possibly be made by Sasquatch, they vary a little bit different than the ones that are reported that are bear day beds, in the sense that there's often stripped bark and everything in them. And with what the bear day beds will be is, of course, bears don't have thumbs to do a lot of different tasks. So they just use their front claws to dig around and to make an area that they can rest in. With a lot of the ones that are reported to be Sasquatch ones, as well as bear ones, quite often you'll find them in an area underneath overhanging branches so that the bear can sit there and look and see things before they could see it. So it's a way for it to scope out an area without being seen. And that's often reported with the proposed Sasquatch ones as well. But one way, again, that we'd be able to identify that is if you go in there and into a particular nest of some kind and take some hair samples out, and then at least we'd be able to identify if they're bear. But if they're not bear and unknown, well, then that leads open the possibility that they could possibly be Sasquatch, right?
Exactly. I understand they're quite large and very remote. So that's also kind of an interesting tidbit with that. The trail cams you put out, have you captured anything, any images on those trail cams thus far?
Well, lots of wolves and cougars and other hunters, bears. Yeah, we've got captured lots of different animals, elk, but no Sasquatch or anything yet.
That seems to be the case of most of the people I talk with that put out trail cams. It's difficult
Yeah.
to get anything definitive. I've had a few people, where you have that wispy something, hairy looking something go across the camera, but you certainly can't tell what it is.
Well, it's funny. We usually try to set up our cameras where there's three of them so that all three of them are seeing the same area in the middle. Um, and so we were checking the first camera, which we had just set to individual photos. And we got some of these photos where whatever it was up close to the camera. You saw lots of black hair, and that was it. We're thinking, oh, this is odd, right? Kind of strange. The other two cameras we'd set to film, and they were within the range of capturing what was ever around the other cameras. And so with the video, we could see that what it was is it was a bear that came along, and I guess it could smell our scent on the tree near where the camera was. So it came up and was just sniffing around. So we were seeing sort of just the back of its mouth in the photos that the camera was taking. So if all we had were those pictures, yeah, you could say, well, what was this, right? I mean, obviously bears are black, and on the island here, we don't have grizzlies or brown bears. So, I mean, it could be a Sasquatch, but again, it's one of these, it could be, doesn't really provide it doesn't move the process of discovery along any further. But with those other cameras, we're able to say exactly what it was. It was a bear. So again, those are the kind of things you have to have in place if you're gathering evidence, right? So I always recommend to people to always, if you have the other cameras, to set them up to do it that way, because for instance, if you do happen to capture a Sasquatch in the footage, now you'll have three different angles of it, right, coming through. So therefore, I would believe that that would provide a lot more evidence to support the claim that it is an actual animal that walked through that area. Then that animal was identified as a Sasquatch, because it's not just a blurry picture or just the back end of something leaving a camera shot. So
I think that's a great idea, the three-way shot, because that does give you a lot more critical evidence of what you're actually looking at. Have you ever put, or do you put anything like in the middle of all of that that might be enticing, like shiny things or food or something like that?
Um, yeah, sometimes we've basically scented the area. That's why we get a lot of different other animals coming along because they'll smell it. So obviously, I mean, I don't know much research has been done about how powerful those Sasquatch's olfactories are, whether or not their scent is heightened for smelling different things. So, that leads to a lot of questions. There's some animals that it's very heightened and can smell something from a few miles away. Bears, if you ever, actually, I've got one here, a bear skull. So you can see in a bear skull here with its snout, like a dog's, it has a lot of areas within its olfactories for picking up scent. And I remember a few years ago, we were in an area checking things out, and up on a ridge behind us, we saw something that was black and hiding behind a tree and doing this behind the tree, kind of. And so, we got our spotting scopes out and everything. We're watching this thing. And then it kind of disappeared. But then it came out from around the front of the trees and then came out and we could see all of it. And it was a bear. It was a bear staying with its back legs, but it was doing that to get a better scent. And it was smelling us. We were about maybe 2 or 3 kilometers away. So quite a large distance, but it could smell us that far away. So as I say, does Sasquatch have the same kind of olfactories to be able to smell something that far away? It's speculation. We just don't know, right? But if it did, perhaps, scenting something could be a way of enticing them in. The hard part about when you set up trail cameras too is they only have a small distance that they pick up things. Um, so to cover a large area, you need multiple cameras set up. And, there's an expense to this. And I don't know of any researchers that would have 300 cameras out in an area to cover an area. And we think about that as being a large area. A colleague of mine figured out there's this park close by to us, and we know how many kilometers or how many hectares this park is. And when you figure out the range of the cameras and the area that it picks up, sort of in an area sent out like this on an angle, how many cameras would you need to do to cover every square foot of that park? Um, well, I think the number he came up with was just under 500,000 cameras would be needed to cover every square inch of that park. So when we have different researchers going out to different areas, they're setting up 2 or 3 cameras or maybe 4 or 5 in an area. And you have to have what it is you're looking for, walk in front of one of those cameras. So this is where you have to look at things like finding a pinch point. So, or a game trail. If other animals are following this to get to water or to get to food resources, perhaps the Sasquatch, which is just another animal, would do the same thing, right? So, that's how you can get your limits down as to finding a good spot where the rate of a possibility increases. So looking for these different pinch points when you're doing your camera setups.
Well, that's also wise. I know several people I've interviewed, or at least a few, have talked about creating these boxes that are difficult to open. You have to have the thumb, you have to have the ability to figure out how to open the box. And a few of them have had, and then they'll put something that's wrapped, a packaged food item or, protein bar or something like that inside. And a few of them have had it's been opened, the food bar has been taken out, it's been taken out of the wrapper, and the wrapper put back in, and the box closed back up. What do you think about that? Have you ever heard of any research done in that specific?
No, I can't say I have. I mean, I know there's lots of different researchers that are doing different things um, to get the Sasquatch involved in things. It always gets back to me is that, these are animals that are out in the wild. We do know that animals of any kind, like moose, bear, cougars, they as we get more into their areas, they're having to deal with more human-based things um, in their environment. Um, so it's hard to say whether or not something like that is research would work. I would hope that they would have set up a couple of trail cameras so that they could see what was coming in and taking stuff out of the box. Because to me, that's the only way you can actually prove something. Um, there's always amazes me too. I'll go out into different areas and people tend when you get into thick forest and you're hiking, um, most people don't stray off trails or go too far from their vehicles on logging roads. Um, but then it's also hard for people to actually carry something out with their cameras or whatever to get very, very far away from these different ways of getting in and out. So the possibility that it could have been a person is always there. So again, this is where some way to document it with trail cameras is the best way. Because then you've eliminated that it was an actual person that found this out in the woods. And we've walked out in the woods and found a lot of very strange things. We've hiked up a creek where there's no trails or anything. And then we've come across a spot where a person has like a nice little sandy beach on this one little hidden away kind of part of a creek where they've hung out there. And we know that it's been a person because we find their cigarette butts in the sand, or we find some of their litter that they've left there. And I think to myself, like, wow, they hiked for like an hour to get here to just leave this crap. So it always amazes me, how far people will go into different areas. So unless you can have the proof of what was there and what did it, it's very difficult to say that it was a Sasquatch. Again, it's just a theory at that point. It's not proof unless you can have some visual proof of the
Exactly.
Sasquatch there opening the box. So that's the missing piece in that one.
Hmm. Dumpster diving. Have you heard of Sasquatch going to a more urban type places and doing dumpster diving?
Yeah, there's been a couple of reports, I think, from British Columbia where they've been seen around garbage dumps and that kind of stuff. From what we know, they tend to be sort of omnivores. So there's been lots of reports of them here in the province when the salmon are running, being near rivers and creeks that support the salmon, and also to digging for clams on a beach. I would assume that as more and more people build houses along clam beaches and more people want houses along a river, it's going to be harder for for the Sasquatch to be able to use those areas as food sources. So perhaps they are sometimes having to go and look through the dump and stuff like this for food. We know a lot of other animals do that, right? I mean, you go to a park or into a lot of more rural areas, they have the heavier trash cans that are super heavy to move and made out of metal specifically so that bears don't get into them. So we know that other animals do that. So it would make sense that probably a Sasquatch too, as an opportunist eater, came across some bins of garbage with foodstuffs in it, would maybe possibly take that on, right?
Exactly. A few people that have just accidentally run across a Sasquatch, out in no from nowhere. It seems a little traumatizing to them. It's a creature they do not believe exists, have not they're not familiar with the idea, and they just really don't know what to do with that piece of information. A lot of people don't even tell anyone about it. When they
Yeah.
finally do tell someone about it, and I'm sure you've run into stories of that nature.
Oh, definitely. When I've given talks, I know the same thing John Rindernagel always mentioned to me was, he'll give a talk on the Sasquatch and, afterwards there'll be a few people that'll come around and ask him questions about his talk or his research and this kind of stuff. And he says there's always at least one or two people that will just sort of be sitting at the back listening and not saying anything. And once everybody else leaves, they'll come over and that's when they say to him, well, I I got to tell you something. I did see one, this kind of thing. And he says, they give a very straightforward, down to earth report about what they had witnessed. And for a lot of them, yeah, maybe a little bit of them doesn't want to admit to that in front of a group of people in case they get judged on it. But for a lot of them, he says they're just happy to know that what they saw is a real thing or that there's active study going into this thing. It does mess, I think, with people a little bit because, where we live, we tend to know all the different animals that are out there and everything. And to see one that's not seen by a lot of people and to visually see it, the fact it is on two legs. I mean, obviously, we have all the different primates and higher primates like gorillas and orangutans. They tend to all be knuckle walkers. I mean, they can walk on two legs, but it's difficult for them. It's not in their environment, in the jungle environment, they can, they can walk around on all fours and it makes sense. But you think about the possibility of Sasquatch. If it is North America, it makes more sense for it to be able to walk a longer distance to find food sources. I mean, in North America, we don't have the kind of rich food sources that are available in a rainforest jungle where there's tons of different fruits and all up in the canopies of trees. It makes more sense for a lot of these animals to be able to climb. So I think that does definitely make people uh, a bit more unnerved by it, the fact that this thing walked on two legs, and had hands, visible hands, that they see the hands and this kind of stuff. So I think it does sort of really throw a bit of a spanner in people's thought process, and it becomes, um, unlike seeing a cougar at close range in the forest or a bear, we have so much information about these animals. They're in zoos, they're this kind of thing. We know a lot more about them than we do Sasquatch. So I think it does hit a bit of a nerve with people because they are seeing something that a lot of people in their lifetime will never see. So I think it does sort of spook them a little bit in that way.
Probably less, maybe a little less now because it is more of a topic that you hear about. I know a farm not far from where I grew up back in the 70s, I believe it was, possibly the 80s. There were two farms across from one another, and they were seeing something that they described as kind of a hairy monkey-like looking thing that was on their farms. Both of these people saw it there, but they didn't associate it with Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, as you call it. So they just didn't go farther than that. They thought it was something that maybe had escaped from a zoo, or it just wasn't in their mind to even be able to go there. That this is what we're talking about. But in that area, several people have, even to this day, past that era, seen something that they felt like along a river and along some bluffs, were witness to various sightings there. Brief, but still, sightings along in that
Mm.
area. So sometimes sightings may occur, and unless you're familiar with what you're looking at, you don't even know how to categorize it.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, right? People see something that's out of the ordinary, and they can't quickly put it into a box as to what it is. Um, yeah, I mean, I think, I guess the same thing could be said for when someone has a very unique sighting of a unidentified flying object or something, right? I mean, they probably know that these things, it's in the media. There's lots of documentaries on it. It's in mass media, of course, with movies like, E.T. starting sort of things off in that way, or in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So it's not entirely unknown, but still, no one really goes out for a walk in the evening and expects to have a situation like that occur to with them, right? So, um, I think it just basically it's difficult because it's just not part of our human experience, right? It's just very unique and very different, and I think a lot of people have it sticks with them, right, as an unexplained thing. I've also talked to a lot of other people that, when they find out my interest in the subject, will say, "Oh, yeah, I saw one of those," and they're very kind of flippant about it. And then I start digging into their sighting and everything, and they had a very unique sighting but they've been able to figure out that that's what I saw. Okay, that just goes on that shelf in their mind about what it was, and then they move on with life. Doesn't affect them after that. I mean, they're interested and they're very curious about it, but I think the hard part is that when we have something we can't explain in a way that we're used to explaining things, it does tend to um, bother people, or it tends to, it's something that they can't put in a box on a shelf somewhere in their mind as to what it was. And so it's there all the time as a thing that they can't answer, right?
Exactly. And and it impacts people in different ways. Some people become obsessed with the research after seeing one, and
Yeah.
other people don't ever want to see one again. And other people just put it out of their mind and forget it ever happened. So the people do tend to have different responses, that's for sure. So you
Yes.
just got back from a conference where you were speaking. What did you hear at this conference that was interesting, fascinating, that you can share with us?
Um, yeah, there was a lot of research. Thomas Steenberg was there, and he had a lot of information about the Patterson-Gimlin footage. Um, and that was very interesting. Again, most of the stuff that I always found very interesting is the time afterwards when you meet up with other presenters for dinner, and that's when you often hear a lot of information, of course, that's always intriguing and interesting. And Dr. Jeff Meldrum was there as well, and his talk was really amazing and really good. And again, it also talked a lot about the Patterson footage. Um, and of course the tracks too. And people forget about this is that when they talk about the Patterson Gimlin footage, is the fact that not only did we get amazing footage there, but we also got tracks. And that's very rare that we have a sighting that also provides us with tracks. Quite often we find tracks long after the creature left them, even if it was a matter of days. There was no sighting and then tracks being found. And then with the Patterson footage, we had a sighting by two different witnesses. We've got, you know, we got footage, 16 millimeter film footage of it, and then we also have all the casts that were casted, the tracks that were casted. So that's very unique. We don't often get that. We usually get one of the three, but not all three.
Well,
So
yeah, exactly. That's a lot of proof there. So anything
yeah.
else from the conference that you could share?
There were some other presenters on the Sunday that are actively doing investigations in Washington State, and a lot of their information was very provocative and very interesting. So it's nice to know that there are so many different people in different parts of Canada, the United States, that are out there actively doing research. I think that's a really important thing, and again, I'm a member of the BFRO, and the one thing that always attracted me to that was the fact that they shared all their information. You can go to the BFRO website and see all the different reports. You can, if you're an investigator in a certain state or province in North America, you're right there. You've got a lot of active uh, cases that are well documented. The BFR investigators as in that area has gone out and interviewed the person who had the sighting, been able to go back and take photos and that kind of stuff. So it's a really good way. I've always been a big believer in sharing the information because that's how we work together as a team, I guess you could say, of Sasquatch researchers. That it all involves a lot of sharing of the information that has been and the research has been done. And I think that's really what's going to hopefully move the process of discovery forward is that kind of sharing of the research.
A lot of people have said until a body is found, there isn't going to be real and made known, I should say, a body found and made known to publicly, that there really will not be a lot of, I guess, enough proof or enough to convince people that this is a real thing. Yeah.
Yeah,
What
I
do you
mean,
think on that?
well, that is true. I mean, that is what's going to happen for science to take this seriously, right? Um, because we know that's how the process works, right? Um, I mean, until what 18, I can't remember the exact date, 1843 or 53, whatever, when the first ape, dead ape, was brought to London and examined by scientists, and they were able to chronicleize what it is and everything. It was an unknown species at that point, and yet people that lived in that part of Central Africa for eons knew about the existence of the ape. Same thing could be said North America, right? The First Nations people in Canada, the United States, had known for such a long time of the existence of the Sasquatch. We see it in their art, and we see it in their storytelling and legends. That was the way they passed on information, right? Was they never written language, so a lot of it was all done that way. That's how they kept track of their history. Same thing in Africa, right? And then when we had uh, Europeans moving into Central Africa and farming and ranching and all this, they started to see it. Same thing in North America. We had tons of different Europeans in North America in the 1800s seeing Sasquatch, reporting Sasquatch. It was in, Scott McLean gathered all these different newspaper reports of it, all from across North America, going back to the early 1800s up until, the early 1900s, all these different reports of the Sasquatch by European settlers. That's sort of the same thing that happened in Africa. But when did the gorilla become an actual animal in the eyes of science? Well, it was when a dead one was brought to London and it was cataloged and categorized and then shared. So that's the missing part in the voyage of discovery for the Sasquatch, is that's the one thing we're missing. And yeah, it will be, there was always talk of a logging truck hitting one, or people finding a dead one in the forest that the other forest animals hadn't taken apart and in eaten and distributed all the bits and pieces and bones and all this. Or it will be somebody shooting one. And not that I'm looking forward to that day in any way, in any situation. But if we do want to say when will this become a known animal that is documented, and now it's in our field guides for animals of North America, and there's a page on the Sasquatch, that will be when it will happen. But there are different steps happening with eDNA testing, and that's what we're doing here on the island. Is we'll go into a water area, so like a creek or a river, and extrapolate the DNA from that water source. And with that, with eDNA testing, and then that E just stands for environmental DNA extrapolation out of this, then perhaps we can find out more information about that. But unfortunately, with the same thing we found with hair samples and this, all they'll say probably is the labs will say, oh, well, the sample was contaminated because we're finding this DNA in there that shouldn't be in that water source. So whether or not it's an unknown one, or they'll often say, well, it's close to a human one or whatever, so it's obviously been contaminated. The same thing we experienced with hair samples or with scat samples where there's been DNA in it. Plus, as we move further away from a physical DNA out of something, there's more room for error, and with that, there's also more room for contamination, as they would say. So whether or not that will actually become a road to the discovery of the Sasquatch, it's hard to say at this point.
Well, at least you're trying and giving it your best, and
Yeah,
a
that's all
lot
you
of
can
good
do.
researchers out there are doing the same thing. So I appreciate you joining me today, Alex. And I'm going to end our talk today, but I will tell you when this comes out. And thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you very much.